Hey guys, it's Miss Cat, and today we're going to be comparing graphic file types. The two types we are going to be talking about are vector and raster. So let's start off with raster. Raster graphics, also known as bitmaps, are images created by grids of pixels or points of color. Think of the old 8-bit video games. All of those were created using very simple raster images. You can see each pixel of color that goes into creating a character or a background. Now you may be thinking that you aren't creating anything raster because your graphics don't look like an 80s throwback, but in truth, most images out there are raster. Any picture you have ever taken is a raster image. The camera is capturing that moment and placing color in each individual pixel to recreate the image. Raster images allow for a wider range of color and complexity. That being said, raster images do have their drawbacks. One of the biggest is that they cannot change scale without losing resolution. That means the larger you make an image, the more pixelated it will become. When you go to scale up a raster image, the computer has to recalculate the pixels and what color goes where. This is why when we are working in Photoshop, you will often get fuzzy lines when you are trying to scale up or down. Now, let's talk about vectors. Vector graphics are created through a sequence of mathematical statements that place lines and shapes in a given 2D space. Think about when you were in algebra and having to graph lines on a grid. Now, since vector images work off calculations of lines and shapes instead of plotting colors down, we are able to resize an image without any pixelation or loss of resolution. Since vectors are resizable, they are used for logos, which often need to be printed on a business card and then put on a billboard. They are also used for a type of 2D animation called vector animations. A lot of kids' cartoons nowadays use this type of animation style. Vectors may seem like the whole package, and you may be wondering why we don't use them all the time, but they do have their drawbacks. Vector images are usually limited in color and complexity. When creating a vector image, you can't just paint down color. Instead, you have to create the lines and shapes, which can be quite time-consuming. Okay, so now that we've compared the different types of graphics, let's talk about how we create those. And for the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about the Adobe Suite because that's what we have and that's what we'll be using in class. So first, let's talk about rasterized images. To create a raster image, we're going to be using Photoshop. And as we said before, every photo that really exists out there created by a camera is a raster image. So in Photoshop, it allows us to manipulate images and to save them as different types of files, right? We can also create our own little drawings and stuff like that. But let's focus on the files that we can actually export and save as. So we can save it as a Photoshop file, and we can save it as a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF file, and a lot of different files, but all of those do not allow for resizing in a vector format. So let's move on to vectors. So to create vectors, we use the program Illustrator. And what Illustrator does is it allows us to create those vector images in different ways. So one is that we use that pin tool to create it that you use in Photoshop, but it actually saves it as a vector. Or you can also bring in images, and if they're simple enough, you can turn them into vectors. Okay, now that we learned about the different types of graphics and how it is we kind of use them, you might be wondering why it is you learned about this, because we haven't touched on it yet at all. That's because we've been making raster images in Photoshop and we haven't moved on to vector. So now we're actually going to be getting into vectorizing images. We're going to be creating motion graphics with those, so it's something that I need to touch on so you understood what it is to be able to resize an image and what that difference is, along with just the file types, because that is something you need to know in graphic design. So with that being said, our next video will be going over a little bit of how to use Illustrator so that you guys can get in there and actually start working. That's it for now. Have a great day, guys. I'll see you in class.